Father Ockerse. So thank you so much for returning to the lounge room for a third time to wrap up our discussion on the theological virtues. And tonight we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the three theological virtues, being the virtue of charity. And to start with, what I thought would be a really interesting direction to take this discussion in initially is talking about what it actually is to be charitable, because there seems to be a bit of a misconception in the modern world with Christianity and Catholic charity per se, where people think that to be a good Catholic / Christian and to be charitable means nothing more than being nice. And I think for us to have a meaningful discussion, we should probably clear that issue up to start with. So, Father, what is charity?
Well, Thomas, with a comment like that, I think we've just gone right to the heart of what would really, I don't know, shake the viewpoint or the whole worldview of many people. And it's very funny because I mean, obviously knew we would talk about charity, and during the week, I happened to recall that a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from a fellow that I know in Bunnings. I regularly visit our local Bunnings. I have an interest in tools and do-it-yourself type things, and I've got to know the guy who's usually at the door pretty well. He's a really nice bloke. He in fact used to be a Salvation Army minister, for want of a better word, and he of course has always been a bit intrigued by ecclesiastical attire and a walk-in, and we've had some somewhat in-depth discussions and so on and so forth. It's developed a bit, and I happened to get a phone call from him a couple of weeks ago, in fact, and this phone call was about his daughter who lives in Gladstone, was very distressed because a friend of hers, a fairly good friend, had in fact committed suicide, which was quite topical considering what we were talking about last week. And she was especially concerned because he was a Catholic. And a friend of hers had told her that being a Catholic, he would be refused ecclesiastical burial by the Catholic Church. Another friend of hers had then come to her and said, but, you know, the Catholic Church doesn't really do that anymore. They will just bury him and so on and so forth. Now, to the modern ear, you would think, well, it's a very nasty thing to do, isn't it? Someone's just died in really most horrific circumstances. It couldn't be a more traumatic time for the family. Why would the Catholic Church have such a position as to say, we're not going to give the comfort of an ecclesiastical burial to this family? We're not going to give them this opportunity of the funeral mass and the funeral liturgy and all these things which Catholics know we get so much comfort and consolation from. Now, the reason why this chappie was ringing me was precisely because he understood why the church would do that. And he was concerned to hear that it could be possible that, you know, a Catholic priest who presumably understands what Catholic charity is, or Christian charity is, the supernatural virtue of charity, why he would happily throw away doctrine in order to be nice to this family in their difficult time. And it really drove it home to me that really in the modern world, all that people want to be is to be nice. No matter how bad something is, you have to look past it. You have to find a way of just being conciliatory, you know, that sort of thing. But the reality is, of course, that for a Catholic, we don't just live in this world. It's not a question of this world. Really, we want to get to the next world. Exactly what we were talking about with hope. We said hope's looking to possess something in the future. It's looking to possess an eternal happiness, which we sort of mentioned was God himself, the infinite good that God is. But the reality is that you can't achieve that unless you follow God's game plan or God's rules or God's signposts pointing where to go and how to get there. Now, there's only one thing that takes you off the path to heaven, and that's called sin. You know, when somebody sins, they are turning away from this path which is leading them towards heaven, this path which, in fact, you can give it a name. It's called charity. And you're turning away from that path by sin, and consequently you will never obtain the eternal happiness, because Just like if I'm driving to Sydney, I have to follow the signs to Sydney. And if I decide that I want to follow signs to Cairns or Townsville or something, I'm not going to get to Sydney. And if all the people along the way were really nice to me and just said, oh, no, just keep driving, they're not going to be actually being charitable. They're not going to help me obtain the end that I wish to obtain, which is Sydney. And so in the same way, if we say to the sinner that, it's okay, just keep sinning, God doesn't mind, God's laws are really just there to be broken. His plan for getting to heaven is really just a suggestion and is completely optional. And if we were to say all these sorts of things to sinners, we're not being charitable, because we are actually actively preventing them from obtaining the happiness which they seek. They've mistakenly followed some other path. And really, if we were charitable, we would say to them kindly, of course, and in an understanding way, but we would say to them, you need to correct this. If you want to get to heaven, you have to change this path that you've chosen. So to bring it back to this really quite tragic story that this fellow from Bunnings was telling me, when somebody has deliberately, with full knowledge of forethought and all the rest of it, taken their own life, they've done something which is completely contrary to the law of God. And as a consequence, even though we don't know, obviously we don't know their heart, and we don't know what went on, their internal decisions, and exactly how much they were in control of their actions, and whether they repented of their action, and so on. We don't know these things. But from all the external stuff that we can observe, it seems that they died enemies of God. And so to make it very clear to everybody else who's still living that this is bad, this is something which means that they're not able to obtain the eternal happiness of God. That's why Holy Mother Church, in her kindness to souls, denies these consolations of the ecclesiastical burial. Because she's saying to her children, if you want to get to heaven, if you want to be happy, you need to do these things, and you must not do these sorts of things. So the true charity is far, far more than just being nice to someone. Of course, it includes in it acts of kindliness. It includes this patience and this forbearance with our neighbor and all those sorts of things. It includes trying to look beyond the faults of our neighbor. Of course, these are all acts of the virtue of charity, but essentially it's this desire to love God, and to then that extends beyond God or within God, rather, is a better way to put it, to bring our neighbors to that same love of God, because it's only in that we can find happiness.
So could you say that charity and even niceness, to a degree, take their direction based on a reality that underpins them, i.e. the existence of God and the way that God wants things? And to be nice to somebody, you could say by definition, is to do something that is in the best interest of that other person. And therefore, taking that in the context of the way things actually are, what people perceive to be nice may in reality not actually be nice. It would only be nice in a very, very superficial sense. And it sort of brings up another term that the church uses synonymously with charity, the love. And so that takes on that opens up a whole new discussion. Love in contemporary society would take on a completely different meaning, I understand, to what the church would define love as, and as a self-absorbed, manipulative action, as opposed to doing something that is genuinely in the best interest of the other person that you're dealing with, or of those around you.
Yeah, no, exactly, Thomas. I mean, everything we've spoken about in these last three lounge room chats, I mean, when we spoke about faith, for instance, we explained that faith is something eminently reasonable. It's something which rests upon reality, which we can observe, which we can know, certainly know, in the sense of knowing it with certitude. Through our senses, we can look at the world around us, we can see how things actually are, and from that we can draw conclusions. And that is the foundation of the beginnings, you could say, of faith. As a supernatural virtue, of course, it needs that light of God's grace, the illumination of God. But in its beginnings, it begins with this rational knowledge of the world. And so, yes, of course, there has to be a real measure by which rate charity or base charity. It has to come from reality. It can't be something that's just made up in our mind. And you're exactly right when you say that the church also uses this word love to describe charity. I mean, charity is a word that we use because it's a very specific meaning of this selfless love, whereas love has, especially in our modern term, it has many other connotations or meanings that don't necessarily have that true notion of charity. I mean, for example, the love between a man and a woman. That if that's true love, if it's true charity, it's seeking the good of the other. It wishes good to the other, and that's true love. But of course, in the modern mind, that's not usually what people mean by love. They don't usually mean primarily seeking the good of someone else. What they mean, that they would perhaps not like to admit it, but what they mean is really love of self. That they're simply seeking their own pleasure or their own self-actualization or whatever in the relationship. They're not seeking the good of another person. They're not really seeking to give everything to them. And that's why love inherently includes in its definition, if you look at it from a Catholic perspective, it inherently includes that notion of sacrifice. Has to be there. Our Lord said it himself in the gospel. He said, just before his passion, just before he lays down his life for us, he said, no greater love doth a man have than to lay down his life for his friends. It's the bottom line, to give everything of oneself, and not just one's external possessions, but one's own very life, is the highest act of charity that can be done. We instinctively know that. We have an instinctive respect and admiration for men who lay down their lives to protect their families or to protect the country, and women too. It's not something which is exclusively the domain of men. In fact, in many ways, it's often the women who show the greatest charity. I mean, the selfless dedication and self-sacrifice of a mother, for instance, in bringing up her children is something that is true manifestation of a Catholic perspective on this virtue of charity.
And that's such a topical example because regrettably, and I think very much unfortunately, a lot of people look on the role of motherhood in a very demeaning way, as sort of a draconian vocation that was outdated, that the minute there were equal rights in the workforce, whereas you think about it and you go, the vocation that's involved with the mother being charged with forming the next generation of people, being responsible for a soul, an individual person, and what that person is going to be in the future. There's almost infinite contemplation that could go into.
The modern world does have this notion that somehow motherhood is at very best is something that you kind of, well, if you choose that for yourself, that's your decision, and that's nice. But really, it's an obstacle. It holds you back in your career. It prevents you obtaining your full potential as a human being, completely ignoring the fact that the full potential of a woman is to be a mother. And so much so that we have this saying that behind every great man, there's a woman. And we don't necessarily mean their wife. We do mean their mother. As you just said, mothers have a way of being able to influence world events by the children that they raise, the kind of children that they raise, and the characters that they form in them, and the aspirations and the virtues that they instill in them will rule events of the next generation, whether on a small local family level or whether on that broader level in the public sphere or even in the international sphere. These men had mothers, women too. As I said, it's not entirely a male thing. It's truly something which embraces all of mankind. We're all made to love.
It's quite humorous because people may smirk and go, look at two men having a conversation about the role of mothers. But I think it's quite self-evident where if you objectively look at what we are discussing, the ultimate accolade that you could give to a woman would be being a wonderful mother, because what can you do that is better than forming the future of humanity, really.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And look, the pages of history are full of it. They're full of examples. They're full of that self-sacrificing aspect of this virtue of charity. Yeah.
And because in these chats we're all about making practical applications and really sort of dissecting what these virtues look like in the world today, isn't it sort of ironic that when, as we've discussed, people talk about love in the world today, and it is really that self-interested notion of what is in this for me, where we look at the consequences of that all around, relationships, business, government, widespread destruction almost. Whereas if everybody adopted, it's quite simple, if everybody adopted the Catholic notion of charity and love, things would not necessarily be perfect because of fallen human nature. But as a starting point, there's a formula for infinitely.
Yeah, I mean, what we look around the world today and we see a world which is divided. We see a world which is heading to all sorts of conflict and is already in conflict. I mean, not a day goes by without something in the news of like today, there was a headline of CIA agents experiencing some sort of a microwave attack on Australian soil, and people going on about, this is just escalating it to Cold War levels and all this sort of thing. Well, these are all consequences of the fact that there is no charity among the human race. There is nothing common. There's nothing. I mean, you have the UN pushing for peace and all these sorts of things. It will achieve nothing if it's not founded on a supernatural vision of love for our fellow man. Because without that supernatural vision, there's no reason why I should sacrifice myself for somebody I've never met and who I don't know and whose language I don't even speak. Why should it be of any interest to me? Whereas if I can see it from a supernatural point of view and say, well, this person who I've never met and who has a completely different life and a different language and so on and so forth, this person is a child of God. And I love him as a child of our common Father. Then you can have a foundation of peace. I mean, in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the virtue of charity, he immediately lists after his consideration of charity in itself, from a theological point of view, he immediately lists after it the acts of charity and the consequences of charity. And the very first one that he mentions is joy. Joy, which goes together with that virtue of hope. Hope is looking to possess the good, which is God, theological hope. And once it's possessed, once you possess that good thing, you have joy. Joy is that emotion that you have once you possess it. Now, charity is not just looking to the future to hope to possess God, but it's already possessing God in a certain way. Not in the way in which we will possess him in perfection in heaven, but already to a certain extent. And that's why you have this joy of the saints. You can read of it in the lives of the saints, the contemporary descriptions of what the saints were like. And these are men and women who possessed something which the world didn't have. They had a joy which they possessed all the time because they had God through charity. And immediately following on that joy is peace. The peace which our Lord says the world cannot give. Peace is a tranquility of order. That's its definition by the great philosophers. A tranquility of order, that all things are in their right place, and consequently that there's not this disturbance, there's not this conflict. And when you regulate your life according to charity, such that you're seeking this love of God, you're seeking the love of your neighbor, it puts all those things in their right perspective. Everything's ordered in the right way, and as a consequence, possess peace. And you see it in Catholic souls, faithful that you come into contact with, whatever. And you especially see it in the moments of trial and difficulty, which is like what we were talking about last time, I think, with hope. That these Catholics who really understand their faith, they have something which the world does not have, cannot give, and really envies in its heart of hearts. It wants that. It wants that peace. It wants that joy, and it cannot possess it because it doesn't have charity. And that's just on the individual level. But that individual level is the basis of the broader society. It's the basis of the international society. Every country is made up of individuals. Every nation is made up of individuals. And those individuals give their flavor, if you like, to the international relationships. And when you don't have charity, on the individual level, you end up not having charity on the supernatural, on the international level,
Mm.
and you end up with the world that we have today.
It's going to take enormous discipline on my part, Father, to keep us on track, because something that has just come up that I think is extremely relevant, not only to this conversation, but it would take us down a rabbit hole into, you know, a labyrinth of other conversations, is this idea that for someone to have real meaningful charity, it's predicated on the basis that there is a supernatural, a transcendent, a God. And I've had the argument, debate, discussion with a lot of friends over a lot of beers, that idea that in the absence of God, that not only is there no charity, but there can be no morality for the reasons that you've articulated earlier, that in the absence of that, it is entirely self-interested, Darwinian survival of the fittest, and it would almost be nonsensical for you to do anything that isn't in your self-interest. And the retort comes, I think it's quite interesting, because people retort with, no, but that's just not how I feel. And I think it's almost that we can, God is so self-evident that you almost jump on that point and you go, exactly, that's not the way you feel. And it doesn't make any sense for you to act in that self-interested way, that if you actually follow that logical chain, you're convincing yourself that there must be a transcendent.
Yes, it's in fact one of the psychological proofs of the existence of God. It's not the strongest. It's not the most metaphysical, absolutely certain proof of God, but the psychological proof is still often perhaps the most compelling for individuals, because not everybody comes to that level necessarily of intellectual understanding of ideas. And even those who are very educated, we can be very educated in mathematics or science or things like that, but not necessarily educated in thinking, funnily enough. You know, it's one of the failings of our modern educational system. And as a consequence, people can actually live their whole life with never fully understanding the intellectual proofs of the existence of God. But everybody has that psychological understanding, and you can't escape it. And as we mentioned already, I think in past conversations, it's almost a natural revelation of God through human nature. In fact, it is the voice, what we call the voice of God, our conscience, talks to us. You know, Saint Paul, talking of the pagans in his epistle to the Romans, he says, you know, they have no excuse because they have that revelation by the things which are the world that they look at. You know, and their own hearts tell them that God exists. But you're quite right that all of this discussion of the theological virtues and the effects that they have in our life and the practical application presupposes both the existence of a supreme being and the fact that the supreme being is super eminently, infinitely wise, good, powerful, and so on and so forth.
If we could,
we would have to, but that would take a very long time, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that was the discipline on my part, Father. Going, hang on, let's. That was my little leisurely departure. Now let's hold on track and get through to the end. Maybe the final thing we can discuss in this talk this evening. So, we've got a bit of an idea of what charity is, what charity isn't, but this one for Catholics and Christians more predominantly, especially in society today. And I take the example from a discussion I recently had about, let's say, Catholic and conservative judges on courts. And it always seems to be that the Catholic in public affairs feels this need to be the bigger person and to turn the other cheek, i.e. in the name of charity and niceness. And it can always seem like to some, the Catholics end up sort of caught in this dilemma where to some it seems like they betray their faith, and to others they go, well, they had no choice because they're the ones that are staying truly objective. And so that can sort of link back to our discussion of what is it to be actually charitable? Is it to be nice? Is it to interpret the law as the rule book says, or is it to hold fast to this truth that you believe in?
Thomas, there's just so much you could say. It is very, very topical. I'm not too absorbed in American politics, but the current events going on in the US have been very interesting in the lead up to the election. You know, our Lord says in the gospel that the truth shall make you free. And it's something which is not immediately obvious to us. But it becomes obvious if you think about it a bit. You know, if you consider what is the truth, it is reality. So when I accept reality for what it is, I submit my intellect to that reality, I'm truly free. I'm able to work with reality. For instance, if I'm designing an aircraft, if I submit to the laws of flight, I say, okay, I accept these laws as facts. This is real. And I design my aircraft taking into account those laws of flight. I will have an aircraft which I will be able to fly, which will be able to do what I want it to do. I will have achieved my purpose. If I, on the other hand, refuse to submit to that truth, I say, no, I'm not going to be bound by the shackles of the laws of flight. These things it's unfair, they restrict my liberty, and so on and so forth. I'm going to design my aircraft however I want. Well, we know what's going to happen. At the very best, it's not going to get off the ground. And worse, it may get off the ground, crash, and I die. And I've certainly not achieved my purpose. I've not found that true freedom. It's a paradoxical thing. You know, when you submit to the truth, when you submit to reality, you find a freedom, which is true freedom. When you insist that you will find your liberty without the need for these, what they call constraints, but are really just guides to direct you to true liberty, then you don't find liberty. You find only enslavement, which, you know, just look around the world today. It's a world which is supposed to be the free West, right? It's supposed to be a democratic world. This is supposed to be the utopian dream that we're living in. And just look at it. I mean, there's articles now, opinion pieces you can read on the Australian saying, you know, is this the end of democracy? Is this the end of the free world as we know it? Is this the end of the West? So on and so forth. You know, and from people of both sides of the political spectrum are saying these sorts of things. And it's precisely because we've just thrown away the truth. And so now the question arises, of course, with a judge. You've got Amy Coney Barrett, you know, nominated to the Supreme Court. Her role as a judge, obviously, if she is confirmed as a nominee, will be to interpret and to apply the Constitution. But of course, you have all sorts of attacks on her by the Democrats. It's usually the Democrats with regard to what she's going to do with regard to Roe v. Wade. What will she do with regard to the Affordable Care Act? Is she going to strike these things down? You know, and the fact is that she kept answering that. Firstly, we don't give an opinion in a nomination hearing. No judges do. That's prudential. That's just how it is. I mean, if you give an opinion, you're pre-committing yourself to
not much of a judge.
there's no point of litigation in this case. You know? You've pre-made your mind. I mean, the whole point of a judge is to listen to the arguments and then to judge those arguments. It's not for them to make opinions and then spout those opinions. Right? So very fair of her to have said that. On the other hand, you have these people saying, well, you're going to definitely strike these things down because you're a Catholic. Now, there is a certain truth in that, because a Catholic judge would have to vote according to his conscience. In other words, he has to follow the opinion, if you like, of God. When you're listening to the litigation, you have to take into account there is someone else who also has a viewpoint on reality. And it turns out that he made reality, and his viewpoint on reality is the viewpoint. You know, insofar as the litigants present arguments which are in a line with that, you know, lined up with that reality that God made, they will be true arguments. And someone who approaches them with an open mind and accepts the truth of those arguments will make the correct judgment, which will happen to be the same judgment of the Catholic Church, because the judgment of the Catholic Church is the truth. Now, that statement, of course, may not be accepted by everybody listening to us, but it could be proven. It could be proven, but that would take, of course, another discussion.
A few more podcasts.
We will have to continue. Yes, but the reality is that if you know, Roe v. Wade is challenged, comes to the Supreme Court, if you are going to present arguments that are true arguments that reflect reality, you would have to strike it down. You would have to. Mm-hmm. You know, there is a constitutional right in the US Constitution, I'm no constitutional lawyer, but I understand that everybody has the right to what is it, true freedom and the pursuit of happiness or something. I forget the exact words. I'm no Yankee, if you like, but you hear those words often enough to know that it is something along those lines.
Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think it is.
That's it. That's it, exactly. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Mm.
So, that's a reality. It's a fact. I mean, okay, the US Constitution may not be scripture, far from it. There may perhaps be people who think it is, but it is certainly, to a certain extent, that particular statement is a true statement.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has the right to those things. Why? Because God made them to be happy in heaven. So everybody who comes into existence, and that we know begins at the moment of conception, you can't deny it. At that moment, that new soul, that new person has a right to obtain that end for which God created it. And we don't have a right to step in and prevent that taking place. No matter what arguments people want to come up with, and we mentioned it last time, to say that, well, it's her body, let her decide. It's not her body. It's most definitely not her body. It's someone else's body, and it's for them to decide. Mm-hmm. So we're perhaps wandering far away, but I think what I'm trying to say is just that, a Catholic judge, when he makes a judgment, he has to make a judgment according to the truth.
As with any Catholic public figure, any Catholic person confronted with any sort of decision that they have to make, their role is not to appear impartial. I mean, that is definitely a consideration. You would want to not that you would want there to be no apprehension of bias, but you're go on.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say you must be impartial in the sense that you must be open to the truth, but
yes.
not impartial in the sense that I must necessarily be open to, the other side of the story of abortion, the so-called pro-choice. That I'm afraid error has no rights to exist.
And just for context, for the context of where this came from, I thought it was quite funny. An article I read the other day where there was a conservative writer in the States. That's just where it's all happening at the moment. All the eyes are on the States. Australia is so boring in comparison. But he was saying, we win the elections, we win the nominations, we get the judges on the courts, and then we lose all the decisions. And he's going, why is this decision after decision where it comes down to, the fundamental moral decisions, the conservatives / Christians always seem to lose. And his point was that it seemed to him like when these conservative / Christian public figures find themselves in these situations, they're almost like deers in the headlights. And so they lose their fundamental impartiality, and they go, I must try so hard to come across like I'm impartial, which means I have to side with the other side. Otherwise, of course, I won't be impartial. And it would seem like,
Well, I was looking at some pictures of these protests against the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. And one of the signs of these people is handing up something like, keep your religion out of my life or something like that. Now, all that's very fine. I mean, I have no intention of forcing Catholicism upon anybody who does not want it. Now, I, of course, want everybody to come to the knowledge of the truth. I want everybody to obtain the eternal happiness of heaven. If they refuse that, well, that's their personal decision. I cannot force them. I cannot force them to accept the truth. But what they are saying by that is not so much, don't force your religion on my private life, but what they're trying to say is, you must accept my false version of reality. It's as if somebody were to decide, to drive on the wrong side of the road and to insist that, no, you cannot force upon me this law that everybody should drive on this side of the road. I'm going to drive on the other side. You can't force that upon me. No, you can't force your personal opinion on the general populace because you are going to cause accidents. That's just not right. And it's the same thing in the moral sphere. These things are not really debatable. They are resting upon reality, and we must either accept that reality or not accept it. And if we refuse to accept the reality, then we cannot force that upon others.
And the conclusion that we can... Oh, sorry, go on, Father.
Whereas you can say that one must accept reality because reality is reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the conclusion we can draw from that is with all these examples that you're giving, a very simple example, but driving, you accept reality on the road, you ensure the safety and the enjoyment of the road for yourself and all those around you. The same in the moral sphere. A lot of people may see, having sacrifice and the fulfillment of others as the dominant factor in charity is restrictive. But really, if that is applied in your life and the life of all those around you, you just think about it logically. How collectively better off would we be, not only as individuals, but as a society at large?
Because we all obtain the end which we're seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in this life, it does need to be said that sometimes that to obtain that universal common good, it does sometimes require this sacrifice of the individual good. And that may sometimes seem somewhat final. As for example, if a soldier gives his life for his country, it seems that for him personally, that was the end.
Mm.
He doesn't seem to have got anything out of this deal. Everybody else has benefited, but he hasn't personally. But of course, we know that this whole aspect of supernatural charity is it's not about this world. Mm. And when you do lay down your life in charity for your brethren, you do receive an eternal reward.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a compensation for that. So in the end, everyone does win. Even though in this life it requires that notion of sacrifice, in the next, it comes with the reward of that sacrifice.
Huge discussion, Father. Awesome. I'm going to take this point to put you on notice for what I think we should discuss next week, which is sort of linked to this discussion, the problem of evil. I think that would be huge to talk about, because that seems to be, believe it or not, a lot of people's objections to the existence of God in itself, and the four horsemen of the new atheism really seem to, your Sam Harris's, your Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, etc., really go after that point. If there is a God, how can he allow all these different forms of evil, whether they're in nature or perpetrated human atrocities? So I think that may be something that would be,
certainly be
interesting to
topic,
talk. What do you say?
Yes.
Let's do it.
Think of it for the next week, and we'll be back on air.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. Riveting conversation as always. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, you're very welcome, Thomas.